Welcome everyone, and welcome to today's Marginal Syllabus webinar powered by the National Writing Project. This webinar is being recorded in late April of 2020, and it's a part of the 2019-2020 Marginal Syllabus. Since 2016, the Marginal Syllabus has sparked and sustained public conversation about educational equity and related topics through collaborative technologies and collaborative partnerships. My name is Rami Kalir, and I work at the University of Colorado in Denver. I'm one of the co-founders and co-facilitators of the Marginal Syllabus, and I'll be your host for our webinar. We have a wonderful group of people joining us in today's webinar to discuss the May 2020 reading of the Marginal Syllabus. And that reading is titled Performative Youth, the Literacy Possibilities of De-essentializing Adolescence. And the article has been authored by Sophia Sarigianides. She's joined us today along with a number of other guests. And so welcome to Sophia, as well as members of our Marginal Syllabus team, including Charisse McBride and Christina Cantrell. So I'd like us to all quickly say hi, tell us who you are, where you're coming from, and then we'll go into a fuller introduction to the work. We'll begin with our partner author, Sophia.
My name is Sophia Cereginidas. I teach at Westfield State University in Western Massachusetts, where I coordinate the English education program, and I am honored to be here. A little more on the context of the study, or just the brief introduction?
Charisse, why don't you say hi, and then we'll have everyone come back around, and then we'll swing back to you, Sophia.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Charisse McBride, and I am glad to be here today. I am a PhD candidate in the Graduate School of Education at UC Berkeley, also a member of the Marginal Syllabus team. I study language literacy and culture, and I also teach in our teacher ed programs across content areas, including our technology, curriculum, and instruction. And yeah, I'm excited to talk today.
And hi, everyone. I'm Christina Cantrell with the National Writing Project. We are thrilled to be partners in the Marginal Syllabus with NCTE and all of our partner authors and the Marginal Syllabus team. And yeah, it's a great pleasure to have another chance to talk about another great article this month. So thank you.
Wonderful. Well, again, we're so honored to have everyone with us today. So again, thank you, Sophia and Charisse and Christina. To begin, we're going to turn things over to our partner author, to Sophia. She's going to introduce the article, again, Performative Youth, and she's going to give us some background. Tell us a little bit about this article, and then after the introduction, we'll dive into our conversation. Sophia, take it away.
So this article came out of what was a year-long study. It began with work at a local regional charter school, public school, that served primarily minoritized students. And that was meant to be just work with teachers. And it began in December and it ended in May of that year. I had a teeny grant to provide lunch and some reading materials for the teachers, and the school provided substitute teachers for the days that I was there so that the teachers could have professional development with me. It was once a month, and the teachers, it was like a course though. I ran it very much like a course in many ways, and so they had to do readings to prepare for, and we met and discussed and did questions, and then that's how it began in the first month, and then toward the end it turned to their work. And at the end of that study, I spoke with the teacher who invited me in, and I'll say a little bit more about how I got invited into that school. And she said, you know, I've changed my whole curriculum for fall because of your class and because of this work. And I said, can I come see what that looks like? And that led to this article, because I had been doing work at the pre-service level, both undergraduate and graduate work with these ideas from New York City into Western Mass, into my two jobs. So from when I was a doctoral candidate, also Charisse, and I had a full-time job at Teachers College, Columbia, teaching, and I taught a young adult literature class, which is where all these ideas started, into this new position at in Western Mass at Westfield State. And what happened was I taught this young adult literature class. It was at the graduate level. One of the students in the class who was a full-time teacher, whose pseudonym is Rachel, and I just hope I don't slip and say her real name, finished the course and said, "Oh, this course has really impacted me. I'm gonna change my curriculum." But in the meantime, she got a little bit more of an administrative position and said, "I really, really want teachers at my school to get access to this information about adolescence." And she, she was one of few teachers of color at the school. She's a Black Jamaican teacher, immigrated from Jamaica when she was in high school. And she was the kind of teacher where students came and reported incidents of racism all over the school. And she really thought that if teachers got a hold of the ideas of adolescence as a construct, that it might impact the racism the students were experiencing there. And that was her impetus for inviting me. And so she gathered teachers who were interested in doing the work, and I pitched it to a much larger group, and we ended up with 4 teachers. 3, as you know, if you've read it, it was 3 English teachers, 1 history teacher, 1 was middle school, 3 were high school. And I couldn't believe that they came in so devoted to the project, given that it was extra work on top of their jobs. And they didn't get compensation. The grant didn't provide for anything like that. It was really because they were motivated to do it. And that was amazing. And then at the end of that, we talked about what they changed in their teaching. And I wrote about that part of the study in 2 separate articles before the one that we're talking about today. And then the main person who invited me in, Rachel, told me about revising her fall class, and I begged to get in there, and I managed to get a study running again, and I pitched it to the students, and everybody knew it was a little class, all Black students and Latinx students, and that's the focus of the study. That's the general background for getting the study to happen.
And so Sophia, first of all, that's just really helpful context, particularly as we dig into the content of this. I'm just wondering, as you also kind of introduce us to your broader work, if you might share a little bit about how you present and also trouble the notion of adolescence and how that gets picked up then in the curricular scope and then the classroom activities that the students participated in. Can you give us a little bit of detail about those aspects of the work as well?
So are you asking about at the teacher education level? Because the study was really, the teacher took some of my curriculum ideas and then she created her own. Would you like to hear about what I do with teachers?
Yeah, tell that, perhaps that, and then also some of the story that you then also describe in the article would also be very welcome. So
this idea of disrupting understandings of adolescence was shocking to me. I had taught for 10 years in California. I moved to New York City for doctoral studies, and I was asked to teach. It was a big opportunity to teach an adolescent literature class. So it was young adult literature, and I was working at the graduate level with very, very well-prepared candidates. And I felt like I needed to up my game. And I picked up this book that I already owned for a while, Nancy Lesko's Act Your Age, A Cultural Construction of Adolescence. And I read the book and I felt like my photograph was in every single page. I was implicated by everything she was calling out about how we tend to think about adolescence. And I thought, if I'm this implicated, chances are students in the class are going to be implicated. And honestly, I didn't know what I was doing in the beginning. I knew I loved her ideas, and I had an inkling that it was connected to young adult literature. I just put the 2 together, and then it grew. And it became something that I started working with Robert Petrone and Mark Lewis to create this lens, to name a lens called a youth lens, which takes those ideas of adolescence and applies them to young adult literature, which is a body of writing that names its audience, right? Which is unusual. Usually whoever wants to can read whatever they want, but this is a body of literature that names its audience. And I was wondering, well, if it's for young adult literature about young adults, then what do they assume about adolescence? And that marriage worked. But beyond that, these ideas of adolescence matter for teachers, because what we believe and assume about the kids that come into the room greatly matters. It matters in terms of what I think as a teacher is important for me to know and to learn and to do. And kids pick up on whatever it is we believe about them. And what we believe about them both offers opportunity and limits who they get to be and what they think is possible about what they get to do in our classes. And I was so convinced of this, that it is an integral part of the program that I run. They get these ideas in my young adult literature class, always, every candidate that goes through the program. And often what happens is, for many teachers, and especially for experienced teachers, which is what the study was doing, I wanted, as pre-service teachers get nervous about the implications of this. And so I really wanted to see what in-service teachers would do with it. Teachers who already had jobs, who had experience, who didn't feel that their jobs were at risk to take on or consider these ideas. That's what I was super interested in. And then see what they would do with youth, right? And so once we start talking about adolescence as a construct, and this is not I'm applying these ideas. This is Nancy Lesko's study. But she details the fact that adolescence didn't always exist as a category. There was childhood and there used to be adulthood. There was no adolescence. That concept came to be across roughly 20, 30 years, 1890s to 1920s. And the way it's a Foucauldian analysis of adolescence. So what you do is you look at the whole cultural soup that grows this idea and shifts this perception. You don't automatically change the way we think about a whole category of people. It takes time and it takes a lot of people to agree about it. But what happens is, once you historicize a category that you have presumed true, once you say, oh, you see this timeline right here? This didn't used to exist right here. Well, that disrupts everything. What do you mean it didn't used to exist? I've held to these views that have so many implications for so long. And so it tends to disrupt teachers and teacher candidates' ideas. And I was so curious to know, I was positive it was going to have an impact if kids got a hold of it. But I wasn't teaching middle school or high school at the time. So I was really dependent on a teacher taking this up and understanding it enough, because it's complicated, and being willing to take on the challenge of, let's see what happens when kids get a hold of it. When you give this directly to youth who are described through this category, what do they do? And then I was also very, very interested, especially in whom the category leaves out, right? So Nancy Lesko talks about adolescence as a category. And it took me a while, honestly, to understand all facets of this. And I feel like I understand more of it as I work with it. That adolescence is a raced category. It is thinking of a white adolescent. That it is a gendered category. It is, the category is framed through boys. That it is a classed category. It's a middle class category, right? And it presumes a heterosexual youth as well, right? So it's a sexualized category, sexualized category. So what does that mean? That to me is really provocative, because so let's take class, which I used to emphasize less, and increasingly I think about so much more. Well, if you presume that what it means to be an adolescent is you have this hormone-riddled, hormone-governed, sort of reckless teenagedom, that's what adolescence is. But you're a working class kid who's got home responsibilities, who's got a job, who doesn't have the money or the time to have that kind of adolescence, then a lot of things happen. You feel cheated. You feel left out. You don't get considered. You don't get to be that which is normative. And that causes long-standing injury. And when I've had students in my classes who've been emancipated minors and who definitely missed an adolescence that is conventionally named and considered, they get angry when they find out about this. Like, you mean this thing that I always felt a loss over, which is legitimate, is something that is also a demeaning category, because we also mock adolescence, right? On the one hand, it's this category of promise and possibility and hope and freedom. On the other hand, it's belittled, right? That you don't have the brain bandwidth to be reasonable, to be rational. And so a lot happens when we start poking at those assumptions of adolescence. And I really wanted to see what would happen if kids got a hold of those ideas.
Well, and they certainly did, and they certainly do a lot with it. And we're, again, just so honored to be able to speak through your writing and the study that you did with the educator, Rachel. And so we're going to get into this, and I'm gonna in just a moment here pause myself, and we'll turn things over to Charisse and Christina. I just want to mention briefly that the work that we get to do with experts and authors like Sophia, creating these conversations and inviting in educators to read and think through the ideas around problematizing notions of adolescence, for example. It's part of a project that we call Marginal Syllabus. And I want to just briefly mention that the project has been around since 2016. The Marginal Syllabus in name very intentionally references the idea that we are engaging with, first of all, authors and ideas and writing that present arguments that may be marginal to the status quo of schooling, and that present a counter narrative to the ways that, again, the status quo of American education constructs itself. And certainly hearing, Sophia, you speak to notions of adolescence really helps us to understand why we would include work like yours in the Marginal Syllabus. We're also, in addition to this webinar and this conversation, going to open up a discursive space, an opportunity for conversation with educators online. And we do so using an annotation tool, a free tool. It's called Hypothesis for people who might join that part of the conversation. And when we do that, we're now opening up a literal marginal space online. It's a marginal digital space, and it allows us to have continued conversation, again, in the margins of the text, reading closely the ideas presented by Sophia. And then the last interpretation of the Marginal Syllabus is that this is an alternative. It is a marginal approach to conventional educator professional learning. We know that many educators are often not afforded opportunities to pursue their own interests, to engage around critical and political ideas in education, and that we are creating an alternative space, a marginal space for educators to shape their own professional learning trajectories. And so that's how our Marginal Syllabus project conceives of our name, our practices, and the work that we do in partnership with publishers like the National Council of Teachers of English, who have been so gracious in being a partner in this work for the past few years, certainly the National Writing Project, and again, partner authors, experts on all kinds of topics, again, like Sophia, who's joined us today. So with that being said, I'm gonna step back a little bit and say welcome to this conversation. And so Charisse, Christina, what's on your minds? What thoughts and questions should we dig into?
You want to go ahead, Charisse, or? Okay. I know you're on a tablet or something.
You can go ahead if you're ready.
Oh, okay. I was really interested in this question about, or this approach, the youth lens approach that is supported youth in reading the text. You and Rachel supported youth in approaching the text, and this is something that you've been supporting in your own class, this sort of approach to reading. I was wondering if you could just say a little bit more about that and sort of the implications of that approach.
So in the introduction, I talked about how I got this opportunity to start teaching a course on adolescence and literature in New York as a doc student, and I was a full-time instructor there. And I had a hunch that these ideas from Lesko about adolescence would do something to young adult literature that in this course I was teaching. And to be fair, I had no idea in the beginning what it was. It just felt right. I don't know how these things happen sometimes. And I started working with them. And because I had such great students too, it started to become clear that, well, when you have these ideas in mind, if you challenge ideas of adolescence, that becomes another way of seeing what texts say about adolescence, right? But I didn't call it a lens. I just knew that it helped with their papers. And then Robert Petrone was actually at a presentation that I actually couldn't be at, but it was a presentation that I was supposed to be at. our baby was being born then, so I couldn't be there, and he got me together with Mark Lewis, and it was his idea to name it, to put it together as a lens, and we started working to craft what that would be. And so what does that mean? So if you think about a feminist lens that asks, how does this text represent gender? How does it represent women? How does it represent men? How does it represent masculinity and femininities? If you think about critical race theory, and how it represents, how this text represents race and racism, right? A youth lens asks, how does the text represent adolescents, both CE and TS, right? The youth themselves. And we wanted to make it accessible, and we wanted to give a way in for teachers through something familiar. So the way that we set it up was through literary elements. So when you're thinking about setting, for example, what are the settings in which you see youth in a text, right? And then how do these settings constrain or give opportunities to youth? And then, how does it affect the kind of adolescence that is available and permissible, right? And so in our big article together, we do a reanalysis of the Hunger Games through a youth lens to talk about how, rather than Katniss begins as an adult at the beginning, and then she becomes an adolescent because she had all the responsibilities of adulthood at the beginning of the story. She's caring for her family. She's the main food earner and acquisitioner, right? She's also exercising tremendous sexual restraint. She's got the hots for her buddy, and she's controlling herself. Like, she's not run by hormones the way we think about young people, right? And then when she enters the games, she becomes an adolescent for an adult gaze. It's the adults who want her to be an adolescent. She's a commodity, right? In the movie especially, they strip her naked to redress her, to make her more sexual. She understands that if she kisses PETA, that will feed into what the audience wants. So in many ways, adolescence is something that is performed for a society that expects it of young people, right? So it goes on, but that's an example, a taste of what a youth lens does. It allows you to not take adolescence for granted, to not take the assumptions attached to adolescence that we've inherited for granted, especially because young people have no voice in naming what adolescence is. It's all adults saying what it is, right? And as it happens with other categories where the person who's talked about or analyzed doesn't get to speak, whether it's race or gender, once the person who's involved, that group of people gets involved in naming and shaping that category, what we think of and believe about that category changes, right? And I give examples in my class about women's bodies and things like that to help students understand what that means.
Great, thank you. That's really powerful and helpful. Appreciate it.
So as I'm looking at some of the findings that you came up with in this study, I'm curious to know what was most striking to you in the categories that you have there. And I do want to share one category that was particularly striking to me, which is around the way that one of the young women responded as she began to kind of take ownership of this category of adolescence and realized, I don't want to be that type of adolescent. Went back into her classroom and is the scene in which, she says the kind of teacher that she would normally feel really imposed upon with, and I guess there were a couple of them who described those kinds of experiences of racism that they had in their classrooms, but the onus of responsibility seemed to lie upon them as they went back to their classrooms and said, I'm not gonna be that type of adolescent anymore. So that was in the category of I guess agency, right? I'm curious about it, and I saw that later on you troubled that and saying that you wanted to talk a lot more, or you had done a bunch more in your work around thinking more robustly around race, and I saw that connection between agency and race. So I wanted to just hear more about that finding and how that's been taken up more in your work.
Sure. Thanks for that question. I could not believe the way the kids were talking about, I would just ask them in the interview, how has this impacted you at all? Like, what, if anything, has it done? All this, this long unit on adolescence. They had to come to my university and give a talk to teachers. It was a big deal. And when they started talking about changing their behavior, now, to be fair, I don't know if Rachel said things like that in the curriculum. She might have. But that's not what I talked about in my classes, certainly. I wouldn't have been in a position to do that because I was working with teachers, right? But when they started saying how they were changing their behavior, that felt much bigger than I expected as a finding in a study on Catcher in the Rye, predominantly, right? There was Perks of Being a Wallflower. They watched The Tough Guys and everything else, but I just didn't expect to see that. And I also thought it was really interesting how the young man who was talking about grinding, which was hilarious, how he was telling me as the white researcher, he's like, I don't know if you know what grinding, it was hilarious. He's like, listen, I know you're a white lady, so I don't know if you know what grinding is. And he's trying to show me. I'm like, I got it. I know what it is. But I loved the example where, honestly, he kind of sounded like Holden when he was talking about, I'm trying to convince people otherwise, but they won't listen because it's this dumb dance move and everybody's doing it. He wanted to protest. Like, he wanted to take this activist position, but he also didn't want his girlfriend grinding with somebody else at the prom. So I thought it was such a nuanced position to say, I get it that I have an option. I get it that I'm sort of a pawn in this game. Other kids get it too. They're still going to do it. And if she's going to do it, she might as well be dancing that way with me. But it gave him solace. He and Atticus both wanted to be called Holden as their pseudonym because they identified so much with a character who was not understood, who felt like a character who was suffering because nobody got him and he had no power to kind of fight back to the discourse, right? And I just thought that his way of saying this is how it impacted me, it was so clear. He made this comment which was unironic, like, I grew up a lot in this unit. In 10 weeks? That's crazy. Who gets those kinds of results as a teacher? It's very hard, right? So much happens in school. And when he named this as an example, I thought that was so powerful. And then the same thing with the student who said that she no longer was combative with this white teacher. What I thought was poignant, though, was Rachel's comments when I showed her the draft. She saw more than one version of this draft, and she said, yeah, I wonder if what I encouraged in students like that was whiteness, was a performance of whiteness in my efforts to kind of trouble adolescents. And that right there could have had a whole other pages and pages of unpacking, right? If adolescence is a white category in many ways, right? Because it's inaccessible. Not all youth of color get access to adolescence for various reasons, because white dominant middle class society sees youth as older, as already knowing too much because of what is presumed about youth of color's experience, then that's super, super complicated, because it is both a coveted experience for kids who don't have access to it for class reasons, or for race reasons, or for gendered reasons, etc. But it's also a category that is demeaned, and these kids were insulted by how they were seen as adolescents. This small group of young people, right? They felt the insult. They took umbrage at how they were discovering that society saw them, that there was no winning. If they were seen as an adolescent, there was no win. Because if they were better than that, if they didn't act like the stereotype, then people thought they were abnormal. And if they acted within the stereotype, they were mocked and demeaned and seen as, oh, you're just acting like a teenager, right? There was just no winning. And it was clear to me, I started suspecting that if young people had access to alternate ways of talking about themselves, alternate discourses, that was where the power lived. Like that's where they could exercise agency. They had other ways of seeing and thinking and talking about themselves. And I feel like those two examples that I shared are examples of that level of agency. I don't know if I've talked myself into a circle. I think I said too much. I don't know if I answered your question, Cherie, so you can ask me another way to say it.
No, I really appreciate that. I think that idea of like new ways of performing adolescence, or enacting agency through this sort of new performance, or new ways of taking on new ways of performing who you are. I think that's really powerful, and I would just be interested to think about what does that really look like in recognizing the race and gendered and classed ways of that adolescence, the dominant forms of adolescence, and how does that just, I guess, how is that accessed, not only individually, but in ways that cultivate solidarity? I just wonder if that's something that has, like, comes forth to again counter these dominant forms of adolescence. I'm just kind of imagining, just trying to think about that.
I think step one is sharing the research with kids. Like they read Lesko. Rachel had them read Lesko, which I thought was crazy. My undergrads and grads sometimes struggle with it, right? It's a Foucauldian analysis. They don't read the whole book, and she helped them. She scaffolded it beautifully. But also, doesn't that honor young people? Like, I think you can handle this. This is super complicated. Grown-ups can't handle it. I think you can handle it. Already you're dignifying them.
Yeah.
Already you're dignifying them, right? So that's step one. Step two is breaking it down. What does this mean? What is it? And it's not in that article, and the one you're focusing on, but in another article, Rachel talks about how she reacted to understanding Lesko, because one of the ways that Lesko builds her argument is to talk about how adolescence was born, the idea of adolescence was born at a time that believed in the great chain of being. This highly hierarchical, racist, sexist system of thinking. And when Rachel realized that, she loved her students and she wanted the best for her students, that's why she bothered to bring me in and it was a lot of trouble, right, to do all this. When she realized that she participated in a way of thinking about young people that included racism as a Black woman, she was horrified with herself, and she felt guilty about that. And so sharing that, bringing that to students, trusting them that they can handle that material, to me, that's one level of how you build solidarity. If I were teaching a high school class, I would say, all right, what I'm about to talk to you about is super complicated. It is not going to be easy to understand because it's got contradictions in it. It's not a super simple idea. I think you can handle it. And I have a feeling that it's going to have an impact on the way that you think about the world and about the way the world sees you. And I think that would be a great beginning. I don't even know.
Yeah.
I don't know if
the other thing that brings up is also the vulnerability that requires for a teacher, because I'm sure there's a point in which, it's in the air, like, is this, how does this square with what you think as an adult? And so just thinking pedagogically, I think that's a powerful tool to bring in. Thanks for sharing that.
My pleasure.
It also, it makes me think, from sort of a writing project lens, or, I don't know. I mean, this idea that the youth, you talk about the connection to YPAR and sort of taking action, around this work. So I thought that was really important. And from a writing stance, it's that sort of like taking what you've consumed and making something in the world, right? And then you also, I think it's Nicole is the name, that she actually made it part of her senior thesis, so to me there was this, this important moment of like, oh, look, they're reading young adult, young YA, you know, do they start writing YA? Do you start, you know, what is the like writerly response to this that we could sort of imagine? Because you mentioned that, you know, often it's not the youth who are actually the writers, right? So it just seems like it has that potential to move into those kind of spaces, and that the kids started to do that actually.
So one part of what we designed as part of the whole thing was we wanted an authentic audience for the students learning. And so from the beginning, I agreed to have the student, agreed meaning it was a great pleasure, to bring the students to campus kind of late in the semester, I think it was about November, to an audience of my teacher candidates and anybody else who wanted to come, including professors. I'm in an English department, so English professors came. And the high school students presented their learning on adolescence to a college audience. And that was amazing. They were terrified, the kids, but they got to come to a college campus, right? And I think they got to eat on campus. I think that was part of the whole thing. And then they were terrified to get on a stage and talk to teachers. And then the last part of it was an activity that was not part of my unit, that Rachel designed, that she thought, you know, we thought, what could we have them do with teachers? So the students were the experts in jigsaw groups in the room, and they had Jamaica Kincaid's Girl, and they got to talk, they got to be in a group with teachers talking about what they noticed in this teeny tiny beautiful short story about what it means to be an adolescent in that story, because the girl gets talked down to and gets you know, there's different readings of how you would read Kincaid's story. I use it for all sorts of purposes, but what my teacher candidates came out of that talking about was, oh my God, then they knew they'd read Let's Go with me. But what they said was, these kids know it better than we do. The ideas they came up with in the groups on Kincaid's story were amazing. And it's been a while since we did this study. It ended in 2012. I'm pretty sure the Rachel students hadn't seen Kincaid before that. It was fresh for everybody in the experience. So it was an impromptu reading and interpretation. They did amazing things with what they noticed about how the young girl was being talked to and who she was being shaped to become, like what kind of girl, right? Because it's a very classed experience that is being talked about in that story. And the experience for the kids getting on stage and talking to predominantly white teacher candidates, this whole stage of Black and brown students was phenomenal. So there was the writing. They had to prepare their presentations, and there was a range. Like Rachel designed the whole thing, but you know, there were kids that came up and just talked about what they had to do in the curriculum. There were other kids that shared their essays from their AP essays on Holden and Catcher, and there were other kids that took it to the real world and showed what they started noticing in the real world as a result of the study and the unit, right? So they would notice billboards, and they would notice movies and songs that they were listening to. And there's a critical literacy component of it. So it was so generative, and really that was Rachel. I mean, I did the invitation, but Rachel guided all of that. I didn't understand how she was going to use Catcher. When she told me she was going to use Catcher, I'm like, oh my God, how is that going to look? I didn't understand. And I knew Catcher in the Rye, but what she did with it was amazing, about how young men, young white privileged Holden, are expected to be super sexual macho guys, and Holden wasn't. And so what does that mean for him? And how, to what extent might that be part of his suffering that he talked about? And so I was asked earlier about what else surprised me. I loved that came out of the study. And I'm sure Rachel had a big hand in helping that interpretation get shaped, but the kids got it, about how, you know, they thought Holden was a big whiny sap at the beginning when they read the book by themselves. And then they got the curriculum, and they started seeing Holden's whininess and complaints as justified, that he was expected to be a boy whom he was not, for various reasons, right? He didn't want to have sex with the prostitute. He couldn't bring himself to have sex with the girl. And what's wrong with that? Like, they could see that was social pressure. The other thing that I thought was surprising is when the kids started noticing how their families we're expecting them and we're almost pushing them to become these like popular young teens, and they didn't want that. Or they also understood that they were getting messages that they were going to be judged if they did that. Like this no-win situation, that they were stuck between two really unappealing positions. That was amazing to me that they got that. And I didn't understand that in the Lesko theory until the data showed me that, which is also really fun for a research study.
Yeah, and that sort of like feeling stuck. I do think that the why part, the opportunity to like do something out of it and make something out of it feels so important because of that, like to be able to foster your own vision. So yeah, thank you.
I mean, to say a little bit more about that, Christina, I think it's so easy if a teacher were to take on this unit to end it with saying, so who needs to hear this?
Yeah.
Who do you need to tell about this? Who?
Yeah.
The doctor? Like the doctor's office? If you look at what everybody, all the warnings to parents about you're about to have a teenager, here's everything you need to tell them. Who else needs to hear about this, right? And then how are you gonna, there's the National Writing Project part, like how are you gonna tell this group that's gonna be resistant to it to some extent, right? How are you gonna pitch it? Who's your audience? What's the purpose of the talk? How are you gonna pitch it is a great opportunity. And that's what I saw happening when they came to campus, is they knew who their audience was. They were scared, and they killed it. They did such a good job.
Yeah,
I didn't have room in the article to talk about that side of it, so I'm glad I got a chance to give them credit for that.
Great, thank you.
I'm wondering if I can pick up on those questions, Sophia, because and kind of come back to them in a circuitous way, if that's okay. So you're asking, through this opportunity for critical inquiry, who needs to hear this, and how are you going to do that? How are you going to pitch that idea? So I want to get to those questions, but I'm going to do so in a hopefully a circuitous way. And I don't want to take too long here, but of course, it's important to recognize that we reached out to you months and months and months ago. We curate this thing called the Marginal Syllabus each year, heading into a new academic year. And of course, when we selected this incredibly detailed and provocative article to read and discuss together, we did so before this pandemic crisis has engulfed the globe and certainly affected American schooling in some incredible ways. And so now we're reading this article, we're engaging with your scholarship at a particular moment in time, at a historical moment that is unlike any that any educator alive, any student alive has ever grappled with before. And so it's in light of that that I actually kind of a few things came to me as I was revisiting your work. I read it first, again, months ago when we were putting all of this stuff together, and I reread it over the last few days again, now as a very different person, as a very different educator with very different questions on my mind. And so I guess one question I have for you is, I'd be curious if you have thoughts about the way that this period of pandemic, this crisis, is perhaps informing or changing our ideas of adolescence. People aren't in school, youth are home now, or they're doing other things, and there are certainly a lot of media narratives out there right now around what kids, youth, students are doing. And maybe you have some opinions about that, and if so, that would be wonderful. But then to get to the questions that you were asking a few moments ago, when you ask who needs to hear this and how are you going to pitch this idea and kind of do this type of agentic, critical, youth-oriented inquiry, how does that perhaps happen now when our teaching and learning has moved exclusively online in the moment, and perhaps will continue to be in and out of digital spaces, heading into a new academic year where, unfortunately, many educators have perhaps less experience than we might like, or less comfort than we might like, teaching and learning online anyways, and perhaps supporting the kinds of critical work that you're discussing. So there's a lot there. Those are kind of two big questions, and I apologize for kind of rambling on, but maybe something there provokes you to jump in.
I mean, one thing that I think about is and this is so ripe and ready for teaching, is critical media literacy around adolescence. So what kinds of stories about adolescents are getting picked up by dominant media, right? It's usually, look at the dimwits, they're not following the rules, They're not sticking to what they're supposed to be doing. They're making it more dangerous for all of us, right? I mean, this is slightly older adolescents that they're usually portraying, but it's always, I mean, I had this really strict household. And so I snuck around to have an adolescence more like conventional adolescence, but for the most part, I wasn't permitted one, right? And a way to think about that, in my mind always goes to young adult literature, because so much of my initial scholarship was around young adult literature. But, you know, what about youth that are religious and that have made pledges of asexuality, right? Not having sex. And how is it that they have control and nobody else does, and this whole category doesn't, right? I regularly think that it behooves grown-ups to see adolescents in particularly stereotypical ways. It maintains the hierarchy of we know better, right? But what it doesn't do is invite in more of the young people who would want to trust us with their vulnerabilities and learning to do more than we might think, right? And so I'm sure that, I mean, there are some stories out there about what young people are doing that's amazing right now too, right? But I mean, one thing I would invite young people to take notice of is, how are you being represented in the media predominantly, and which medias are portraying you in particular ways? I know that we have somebody locally, a high school student locally, who is a super science kid, and he figured out how to print 3D masks and was making them available. Like, that is not what we think about when we think about adolescence, right? That's not exciting. It's not racy. It doesn't fit the norms that we've been fed, right? I mean, this is a kid who's an adult in many ways, who's giving to society, who's got knowledge already, etc. So, but to answer your questions, Rami, about the online medium, I'm not your girl for this one. I did not sign up to teach online. I'm definitely challenging myself to learn new skills, and I'm grateful for that. But I know there are people that you can get much more beautiful responses to that question from than me. I don't think I'm perfect for that one.
Well, Sophia, I think that is in and of itself is so refreshing to even hear you mention that. And first of all, thank you for a really lovely reminder to, again, begin troubling some of the dominant and oftentimes very reductive and negative messages around adolescence right now. But I love that recognition of some limitation of one's pedagogical toolkit. Because none of us signed up for this, right? Even those of us who may be a little bit more familiar with digital spaces and online learning, none of us signed up to even do that flavor of teaching in a global crisis, much less, again, educators, whether it's K-12, higher ed, teacher education, who don't. None of us said, oh yeah, I definitely want to, move my schooling into this kind of mode, which is all to suggest that my fear is that some aspects of pedagogy and critical inquiry will be limited. They'll be seen as additions to what is going to be a kind of re-entrenchment to the basics, and some, again, very reductive conceptions of literacy and learning more broadly. And so the kinds of projects that we read about and the kinds of conversations that we hear in your writing that youth are having, and then their kinds of perspectives, my hope, and again, actually, I also don't have answers in this way, and maybe this is some other work that we all begin to do, is how do we begin in an entirely uncertain educational landscape where, again, many educators, K-12, higher ed, it doesn't matter now, are moving into a new academic year, unsure of what their classrooms will even look like, much less sound like, much less feel like. What will they hear their students saying? And I think perhaps how do we bring to life the kinds of incredibly rich insight and necessary tension and critique that you've shown us? We know that can, under incredibly well crafted and guided ways, that can come to life in a classroom with an educator like Rachel. How do we look for those types of opportunities when we're moving into, again, a completely unknown educational landscape? But I also don't have answers. I really don't. I think that's maybe our work right now.
If I were I do not want to think about the possibility of teaching online starting fall. However, I know it might happen, right? If I were a middle school or high school English teacher and was being told there's a very good chance you're teaching online in the fall, the way that I would go about it is, okay, I tell my teachers that I'm a defensive teacher, but not in the way that it sounds. Like I assume that my job is to be extraordinarily compelling in anything that I present to students, because there are so many reasons not to care about whatever I'm going to present, because not everybody is an English student. Not everybody knows that they could be really successful as an ELA student, right? And so what I would look for, what I would tell teachers to look for is you want curriculum, meaning text, but also the experiences, whatever you design for those texts, that are going to be so provocative that kids will not have a choice but to jump in, right? And to me, if you're going to give me ideas about who the world thinks I am in these rigorous, critical ways, like through understanding adolescence as a construct, I mean, granted, it's hard, but the payoff to me is so big and wait a minute, you're talking about me? I don't have to listen to learning about somebody else or some other group, but it's going to be squarely about me. That could be really compelling in my view. And it's not just because this is the work I do. I would have wanted to know this because it would have been empowering, right? A key chapter that I use in my class, I talk about it in that article, and Rachel had the kids read it. She had the students read it, is a chapter by Margaret Finders called Gotta Be Worse. And this thing, I've been teaching it for 10 years because it's so compelling. The story is about an alternative to incarceration school focusing on gendered literacies. And in the story, it's middle school students, including a main student in the research study is a young middle school student who's pregnant with her second baby. And the title Gotta Be Worse is about how the kids in this program know what society thinks of them. They've already written them off. Like you're already in an alternative to incarceration program by middle school. You're already pregnant. Forget it. You don't get to be an adolescent. You opted out, as if it's a choice. And so what happened for some of the students in that study is Finders made explicit, it wasn't Let's Go at the time because it was before that, but she made explicit how youth are perceived, gave the kids a little bit of access to that discourse. And then there was a newspaper story about how this school really should disappear. And so knowing that and why that community was willing to get rid of a school like this, energized the kids, and they wrote a letter to the newspaper about why they matter and why their school matters, right? To me, you give young people access to the information that is driving the way that they are treated, and that's going to energize kids to connect and get some teeth into the curriculum. I may be idealistic about it, but I really, really believe that. And this is one way to do it. So it's a lens that is about them. And so, and it's so multifaceted because you could really emphasize the racial side of it. You could really emphasize the class-based side of it. You could really emphasize the gendered side of it or the sexuality side of it. And so there are many ways that young people could say this side of it, especially, or if they could do intersectionality, really, really speaks to me. That's something that you could take up then and give them agency to work with, to understand themselves, because I think so many of us go into higher ed in order to understand some facet of our own experiences, right? So how amazing would that be to help them with understanding who they are, why they're upset or angry or feeling whatever they're feeling, but then also do something about it. I think that could be potent in whatever environment we're going to be teaching in the fall.
So I was hesitating in case Charisse wanted to jump in. I know she's been thinking a lot about a range of these issues in her own work too. I just, sometimes reading this work, looking at YPAR work, I think, what this moment needs is actually more needs young people to be engaged in the problems of the day, you know, and we need that thinking and that energy. And if we could engage, support young people in feeling it, in having the agency, or, you know, in our educational spaces, then what could we actually solve together right now? It's just a question that I have, and that this work, you know, continues to inspire forward. Like, yes, we actually really, you know, we need each other now more than ever. I mean, not that it hasn't ever been, I feel it's always been true, but it's just so explicitly clear. And how do we support that moving forward is a question that I take forward in this time. And I think, you know, when thinking towards the fall and all that, like, how can we do that together?
I mean, what happened? I mean, so I posted on Facebook about this because I'm just so upset about it, but somebody else wrote this so beautifully, that I have a lot of teachers in my grad courses who are teaching at schools where everything is about the standardized test scores, especially charter schools. And what happens when the driver for curriculum is taken away? We're not doing standardized tests this year. And then now, how have you justified this diminished curriculum that you are force feeding down really creative, really capable teachers' throats, and the kids aren't even taking this test that you've been saying is so important, right? So to me, that's like back to Rangi's question too. It's all right, if we're not even in classrooms together physically, then, I mean, you've taken that out now of what we all expect schooling is, then what really matters now? So what does matter? You know, what counts? I wish I could remember. I don't even know who posted this, but somebody was saying, forget thinking about the next 2 weeks and the next 2 months. Start thinking in the next 2 to 3 years and beyond, because this should disrupt everything, what's going on with Corona, to force us to challenge and think about what else have we taken for granted and assumed about what schooling is and needs to be, and what counts as learning, and who youth get to be, that we need to be looking at. That could be a great invitation that could follow a disruption of what counts as adolescence, I think, as well too, right? If not now, we're not going to get a chance like this again. I mean, I hope not. This is so extreme. Who could have imagined this just 2 months ago?
Yeah, I think about how there's also a lot of assumptions about what youth have been doing online or what they might do online. And now we've all been, you know, now we're all online. And so thinking about digital practices and what we can, like, I feel like we've been invited to this digital space, and we have to, we've all had to get up to speed in thinking about digital pedagogy and what it means to teach and learn online and to engage online, both for our own learning and communication and engagement with the world, but also for our, you know, imagining what it means for youth to be online. There was a call recently from that speculative education call where we were talking about, like, making TikToks and Instagram posts and different things to kind of get into the practices that typically youth are doing, you know, but just to kind of, you know, I feel like we've been now, like, the aperture for meaning making has been opened as it could have been much sooner, but now we've, like, been thrust into this space. So, like, I like how you framed it as, like, an opportunity. And those of us who've been doing work on digital platforms and technology and education, in some ways, like, we've been in this space of thinking about participatory culture and how it's been here, you know. And so now, like, let's all think about it. I'm really interested in continuing to build in that space.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, this is not my area. So you guys are all much more adept at that than I am. I don't write about, nor I actually rely so much more on my students to get me much more on board. Not because I don't think it's important. It's just that I don't know it as well as my students do. But I do believe that if educators don't see this, and by educators I mean writ large, if we don't see this as an interruption of what schooling is in a way that yields something much better after all this, then that's going to be a bigger loss than what we've already lost. And I've got a little kid who's super sad about not getting to go back to school. He's in kindergarten. He loves school. But I've got another kid who there's no loss for him. He doesn't like school at all, right? The way it works does not work for him. My kids are 6 and 8, little boys. I think, I mean, what else is possible for the ones for whom schooling as it's been doesn't work? But I think we've gotten, I feel like I've taken the conversation far further than maybe you guys meant it. But yeah, those are my thoughts right now with Corona.
So this is so refreshing, and I just appreciate the rich wisdom that we're all sharing here, and the images and the possibilities that have come from this conversation. And I'm really eager to learn from other educators, again, across settings and grades and disciplines, who will likely watch and listen to, and then again, hopefully join the ongoing aspects of this conversation that again will occur online as we all start living our lives online. And we've been together for about an hour, and I want to again respect everyone's time. And we kind of always say this in these webinars with Marginal Syllabus, and now more so, here we all are in our homes, not in our offices, with our family around us. And so that desire to again really respect space and time, I think, is even more precious. And so I just really want to thank everyone for coming together. We do always close with a few kind of final thoughts or a takeaway. And so again, I certainly invite everyone here, Cherise, Christina, Sophia, to offer a final thought, provocation, or question that is sitting with you, given our conversation today, given the rich work that we've read, or Sophia, in your case, have written and shared with us. Thank you again. So if any final thoughts are very welcome as we bring today's webinar to a close.
I feel like I didn't answer a question that Cherise posed earlier, and that was the raced adolescent side of the article. So when I closed the article, I talked about how both Rachel and I was really happy. What I wanted was for this whole study to happen at a school with Black and brown youth, right? And especially because the category of adolescence is a race category. And that did happen. And Rachel does address race tremendously, but it's in a, but what the study focused on was not that side of her curriculum, right? So she's an AP teacher. She was a new AP teacher, and needed to get kids to the AP exam. And so so much of the rest of her curriculum was on text buying about people of color. But this part of the curriculum wasn't. She was focusing on adolescence, and she picked a text that she thought would work for the AP exam. So there's a big opportunity for somebody to pick up where this study leaves off, one place where it leaves off, about, well, what happens also when young people understand adolescence as a raced category, right? And that has to be done carefully, because it's going to open vulnerabilities that are already there, especially for already vulnerable youth, in white dominant teaching contexts, especially white dominant, either because it's a white teaching force or a white curriculum or white spaces. That's where my scholarship has gone since writing that article, with the book that we got out, Letting Go of Literary Whiteness. But this part of the study of adolescence, I haven't had a chance to come back to, and I think that affords somebody a great opportunity to study. What happens when young people are also get a chance to talk about adolescence as a race category? I do it with young adult literature in my classes, right? So we look at, I've changed my whole syllabus as a result of that study, in ways that I start to talk about at the end, but I think that's something that deserves more research.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. yeah, I'm eager to read more about how you, that was one of my questions around changing your curriculum and pedagogy, or, from, as a result of that study. And I do appreciate that invitation at large to more studies around that. I think about Monique Morris's work around Black girls and Pedro Noguera's work as well, just thinking about how Black boys and Black girls are, over criminalized and don't really have an opportunity to be adolescents and move from, childhood to adulthood pretty quickly. And as a mother of Black girls, I am concerned with that. And I think about like what's at risk if you,
yeah, we have French.
act out adolescence, or I don't know. I just think of a lot of questions. So aside from that, I think my closing thoughts are around our conversation around the digital, which is where my research is currently. And I just am appreciating this conversation around, I appreciate how you've taken up adolescence in this study and how we've really talked about these, like, the provocations, the complications that come when we really respect adolescents, or youth, I would say, youth's intellectual richness and their ability to dig in to research and to create their own amazing conclusions and inquiry. I really appreciate that. And my hope would be to continue to extend those kinds of priorities in anything that we do in the digital realm as we continue to see our world shift and iterate. My sincere hope is that we would continue to trust our students, trust their capacity for building together, that we would continue to imagine what solidarity looks like with our students and with each other, and that we would center humanizing critical sociocultural knowledge, which is something that I borrow from Kefferlin Brown, that key understanding of it. It really resonates with what you were talking about, with knowing that it's we're countering deficit notions of who our students are, and not only theoretically, but also giving them working with them together to build that agency to change what is, dominantly thought about who they are. And so I think valuing those, their assets and continuing to cultivate critical literacies among our students is really central in whatever we do. And I would hope that, not just hope, but I want to work toward building that into the digital, and not, I really love how Remy pointed out the risk and like going back to these sort of basics that we, as we strip down everything to just what we can handle sort of in the digital realm. I would really hope that we can push to keeping the core pedagogical priorities that really will serve our students as we go forward. So thank you for the ways that you've pushed us with these thoughts around adolescence.
Thank you.
And Cherie said that perfectly. So I just wanted to thank you for these invitations, and these invitations to inquiry feel really important. In about a month, I'll start teaching an online course about teaching writing online, and thinking about, wait, why are we teaching writing in the first place? These are important. Bringing this as an invitation to think about why writing, why teaching writing, and then the implications of what we can do via online spaces and pay attention to and trouble and bring our own voices to, I think is so important. So thank you.
Thank you.
Well, and I would just like to thank everyone who's joined us today. Again, first and foremost to Sophia for authoring and sharing with us this incredible work of scholarship and your broader research agenda and in your thoughts, which I think are tremendous gifts to us as educators writ large, particularly in this moment in time. And of course, to members of our team, Charisse and Christina, thank you so much for participating today and deepening and enriching this conversation. And again, thank you to everyone who's, again, watched or listened to this Marginal Syllabus webinar. As a reminder, during the month of May 2020, in the month of May, this forthcoming month, we'll be collectively reading and also annotating the article that has been mentioned today. Again, it's titled Performative Youth, the Literacy Possibilities of De-essentializing Adolescence. That article will be made openly accessible for educators to, one, just get access to, and then read, and then again, openly annotate. And you can find that article at educatorinnovator.org. For additional updates about Marginal Syllabus, you can subscribe to the Educator Innovator blog, and there's also a newsletter. You can certainly follow the National Writing Project online, perhaps via Twitter. You can also follow the hashtag Marginal Syllabus. Thanks again to everyone who joined us today and who's accessed this webinar. Stay healthy, everyone, and best to all in this remarkable time that we're living through. Take care, everyone, and thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you.